Forever and a Day. Chapter 11. Mary Daniels. Annie was used to being locked in dark rooms. She hadn't had the freedom to come and go as she pleased in such a long time that she was beginning to think of such luxuries as distant daydreams that she'd had in her youth. At least she wasn't alone anymore. For so long, she had nobody to talk to except for the ghosts. Most of them were loud and demanding. She hated all but one, the one who nobody intended to be there with her, Harvey. When she was pregnant with her baby, Annie worried about how she would feel once it was born. She didn't want to think of herself as the type of person who could hate a child, but she feared that she was no longer the person who could love one either, especially one who was the result of something so horrible. The moment he was born, however, her fears were washed away. She loved that child more than anything she had ever loved before. She didn't look on him as the result of her torture, but as a victim of that torture, and she would do anything in her power to protect him. She was standing over his bassinet, watching him sleep and wondering whether or not he knew how cruel the world around him could be. Thomas was in the room with her, watching her from one of the dark corners. He liked to linger. While the other two ghosts would come into her room and scream at her, Thomas would just stare at her for hours, and then whisper into her ear, telling her that she was never going to make it out of that house alive if she didn't help them. She didn't care. As far as Annie was concerned, she was already dead. After weeks of trying to get her to help them and her resisting, Carl had turned to drugs and various devices, trying to make her more willing. There was a time when she could tune the ghosts out and make them quiet, but those days were gone. Now she had no choice but to listen to them. In the city, she could hear the moans and whispers of dozens of ghosts from the surrounding neighborhood, but on this quiet street, there were far fewer spirits roaming. Still, she wished that she could be alone, truly alone. "Stop staring," she whispered toward the corner. Thomas didn't say anything in response. This was the game he played. He would watch her for hours and then say something in such a soft voice that she could barely hear him, but he would make her feel hopeless and empty inside. "I won't help," she told him. "I won't pass messages. I won't. You can't make me hurt people." The thing was, she knew what he would say if he did talk. He didn't need to speak in order for her to hear his voice in her head, telling her that it was all for the greater good of Germany and for the betterment of humanity. But Germany was his home, not hers. She'd never been there, and she never wanted to go there. He might view himself as a patriot for his acts, but if she helped him, she would be nothing more than a traitor and a coward. The other ghosts wandered more than Thomas did. They listened in on the conversations that they were supposed to be documenting, and then they would come to her, demanding that she pass along the information. For a while, she did. Then she realized what they were discussing, and the horrors that could be unleashed upon the world with her help. She refused to be a part of it, no matter what they did to her. Thomas knew her weakness. He told her that her child was more gifted than she was. He told her that he could show the child unthinkable images, and she could do nothing to stop it. The boy would grow up with bloodshed on his mind, never knowing a life of innocence or purity. Annie resisted, but she wondered how long she could. Each time her baby cried, she wondered what was going on in his little head. She wanted to believe that Thomas was lying to her, but how could she be sure? He told her that she was a terrible mother, and that the boy would be better off if she simply died. And in some ways, Annie believed it. If she were dead, the baby couldn't be used as a tool with which to hurt her. She looked toward the corner, knowing what Thomas was thinking, and she hated him for it. Even as he hid in the shadows, she could see his smile. Then, before she could even comprehend the fact that he was moving, Thomas was in her face, looking into her eyes and telling her that they had Joe to work with now. It was only a matter of time before the others decided that they didn't need her or her baby anymore. They'd kill them both. "You won't. You won't because you need me. You need my baby. You need them to know what I know, but I will never tell them. And you will spend eternity as nothing more than a shadow that people see from the corner of their eyes." She walked to a chair where Thomas's violin case was sitting, and she opened it. She looked carefully at the violin, running her fingers along every curve before grabbing it by the neck as though it were a dead chicken and holding it in the air. I can smash you. I can take away your anchor and leave you adrift, and tell me why I shouldn't. Tell me why I should let you exist. Thomas was standing over the bassinet, looking down at the baby. He had evil intentions in his eyes and moved his hand over the baby's face. The baby shifted, and though Annie couldn't be sure that it was because of anything that Thomas was doing to him, she also couldn't be sure that it wasn't. Then the bedroom door opened, and Yuta walked into the room, finding Annie standing there with the violin in her hand. Of course, she couldn't see Thomas, but she rushed to Annie and grabbed the violin, setting it down on a nearby table. Having a talk with your friends? Yuta asked her. There's nobody here. Yuta came as close to smiling as she ever did, and shook her head, saying, It would be so simple for you to help. Annie didn't say anything. She simply watched as Thomas strolled back to his dark corner of the room and started watching once again. But we have someone else now, so maybe we don't need you. Annie and Thomas both knew that Joe couldn't communicate with ghosts the way that she did, but she would never tell, and Thomas didn't have the luxury of making that decision. Honestly, I've grown tired of this whole game, ghosts and mediums and all of that foolishness. I think there must be better ways. But of course, I'm not in charge. If I were, we would have killed you by now. Annie's eyes went to the ground. She wasn't sure that she could say anything, even if she wanted to. She knew Yuta, and how cruel her methods could be. She didn't want to provoke that woman. Yuta turned her attention away from Annie and started to walk toward the bassinet. No, please no, Annie begged. She hated to see Yuta hold her child, but she never had a choice. If she tried to fight, the baby could be hurt. Yuta had more power than she did. I need information, Yuta said softly, as she picked the baby up in her arms and held him close to her. She bounced the baby gently as she looked back to Annie. In her mind, Annie could feel every injection that Yuta had given her, and every shock that had been inflicted. She could feel every punch, every cut, every chain. Carl always tried to play nice, even as he did horrible things. He tried to pretend that he wasn't filled with evil, so he acted as though he were civilized. Yet when he lost the ability to control his temper, even for a moment, very bad things could happen. Max was desperate. He was weak and would normally do whatever the others told him to do, but she knew that she couldn't predict what he would do if he were in the room alone with her. He could pretend to love her just as easily as he could hold a gun to her head and threaten to pull the trigger. Yuta was perhaps the most predictable of all of them. She didn't have violent outbursts. She was steady at all times. Unfortunately, she held steady at a level of hatred and anger that most people could not possibly sustain for very long. As far as Annie could tell, Yuta wanted the world to burn, not because of the master race or the fatherland. She wanted to watch it burn because she hated it. Everything else was an excuse. Tell me something useful, Yuta told Annie. But Annie kept quiet. This was not the first time that her baby had been used against her. There had been times when her boy was taken from her and she didn't see him for days, and each minute of those days was the worst kind of torture for her, made worse by Thomas whispering in her ear, telling her that her baby was dead or taken so far away from her that he might as well be. Every bone in Annie's body wanted to give in whenever her baby was threatened, but she had to bite her tongue and force herself to remain silent. What kind of world would her little boy grow up in if her captors knew what she knew? Earlier that year, news broke about the discovery of nuclear fission. Since then, the world had been buzzing with the possibility of a new power source. But there were many scientists who believed that this energy could be turned into a bomb, more powerful than anything the world had ever seen before. The ghosts could travel, if they focused as hard as they possibly could. They could walk down halls and listen to conversations, but once their concentration was lost, they would be drawn back to one of their anchors, the place they died, or objects that meant something to them in life. They could easily find any scrap of Hindenburg wreckage, which was scattered around the world by this point. Harvey could even pull himself to the other ghosts who died with him. The more connected to an anchor, the stronger the ghost's presence could be felt. The ghosts spent a lot of their time at universities, listening in on conversations and reading documents that were never meant to be released. They tried to report their findings through Annie, but she refused to be a part of it, at least as much as she could refuse. Once in a while, there would be a threat made against her son that Annie could not ignore. Combined with drugs in her system or sleep deprivation or whatever other forms of experimentation had been inflicted on her that day, the threats crumbled her defenses. Perhaps the worst part of her repeating what the ghosts told her was the fact that she didn't know what most of it meant. She could speak words that she didn't know and draw symbols that she could not make sense of, and she never knew when those words passing through her lips would give the Germans what they needed to build that bomb. So far, they didn't seem to have what they were looking for. Nobody had figured out the right formula or calculations or whatever they wanted to call it. There was a lot of talk, but thus far Annie's slips could not have been too valuable to anyone. Now Thomas was standing in his corner, repeating something about a liquid drop model, and uranium-235 being more fissile than uranium-238. It was something that he'd overheard while haunting the grounds of Princeton University. As he whispered, Annie kept her eyes on her baby, being bounced in Yuta's unloving arms. Would she drop the baby, stab him with her paring knife, inject him with some of the drugs that they kept pumping into her blood, snap his neck, suffocate him? She couldn't stop herself from thinking of all the different ways in which Yuta could harm her child, and each idea tortured her without Yuta ever having to draw blood. Yuta looked at her watch and then told Annie, "Tell me what they're saying." "Please don't hurt him." "I don't care whether I hurt him or not. You do. So tell me what you know and we can both have what we want." Annie couldn't think straight. She wanted to find some way of outsmarting Yuta or fighting back, but the more she tried, the more disorganized her thoughts became. There was too much pressure, too much responsibility, and Thomas would not stop whispering. She closed her eyes tightly, begging, "Stop. Please, 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 stop." "Tell me," Yuta said again, in that harsh, ugly tone of hers. Thomas repeated her words in whispers, over and over again. "Your child will likely develop the same abilities as you," Yuta told her. "With the right treatment and training, he could be a very efficient soldier." And Thomas couldn't help but laugh at the word treatment. They all knew what Yuta meant, no matter how much Annie would have loved to believe that not even the Nazis could run such experiments on a child. She couldn't rule out the possibility. Joe had been sitting alone in the basement for quite a while. He didn't have a clock nearby, so he didn't know the exact time, but Carl hadn't returned to inflict pain on him yet, so he considered himself lucky. On the floor above him, Joe could feel that Carl was annoyed and Max was angry. He could hear yelling through the floor, though it wasn't quite loud enough for Joe to make out the exact words. He could hear a woman's footsteps above him, lighter and more graceful than Yuta's. Leah had been allowed out of her room, and she was observing the argument between Max and Carl with a blend of delight, pride, and anger. Joe couldn't help but grin as he listened to them. The house was full of people who were holding him hostage and trying to intimidate him, but each one of them was so easy to read for him. He could find their weakness and play it like an instrument. The funny thing was, he actually enjoyed that part. He'd never deliberately tried to hurt anyone before, but it was surprisingly easy for him. There was no fooling himself into believing that he was the best man for this job, or that he could plot some miraculous escape. Joe was trapped in that basement, and at the mercy of the people who held him there. If they wanted to starve him to death, he was going to starve to death. He could fight them if they tried to torture him, and maybe he would get in a solid punch or two, but in the end he knew that he would be tortured. The only power he had in the situation was to dig around their minds and see what types of seeds he could plant there. Maybe he could distract them just enough to keep them away from him for a while longer. So far, the plan seemed to be working. Leah was out of her cage and Carl didn't like it. Max was trying to prove that he was more than Carl's follower, but Carl was in charge, and he didn't like being questioned. If only Joe could watch the fighting with his eyes, instead of settling for listening to the muffled yelling. Suddenly, Joe wasn't alone. He almost jumped back when he felt someone else in the basement with him. The sharpness of the unexpected emotions caught him off guard, as though someone had physically jumped out from behind one of the old boxes and scared him. He knew right away that he wasn't dealing with one of the Nazi ghosts. This ghost was familiar and friendly. It was someone who was concerned for Joe, but somehow relieved at the same time. Joe found himself smiling as he felt what Harvey was feeling. There was hope. "You told them?" he asked quietly, so that he wouldn't be heard by anyone upstairs. There was a faint sense of pride in Harvey's reaction. Joe couldn't blame him. For the first time since he died, people were listening to him and taking him seriously, rather than trying to write him off as a figment of a broken mind. The baby started crying. Joe could feel panic from Annie, but he couldn't feel anything from the baby. He was too young, and his emotions were too unfocused. "Go check on them, please," he asked Harvey. Before the words were out of his mouth, he was once again alone. He waited for Harvey to return, listening to the sound of the baby crying and trying to figure out what was happening just based on what Annie was feeling. He felt Yuta up there as well, and as soon as he felt her, Joe knew that someone else was up there with them. His companion was watching them with bated breath, taking in whatever was happening to Annie, as though he were watching a beautiful sunrise on the beach. That ghost was such a damaged soul, Joe almost felt sympathy for it. It was a soul that had been twisted into something ugly, and that ugliness was amplified in death, turning it into something that lived up to the word haunting. He wondered how a human being could become such a thing. The question led his mind to Annie, who was far from evil, but whose mind was beginning to feel as deformed as the ghost's. He had to get her out of there. He needed to make sure that she was spared that horrific fate. Joe couldn't feel Harvey. He knew that Harvey must have been up there with Annie, but for some reason he couldn't find him. Ghosts were much more difficult to pin down than living human beings. Funny that the thought should occur to Joe just as someone started walking down the basement stairs. Joe hadn't even noticed that the door had opened, or that the yelling had stopped. Carl stopped once he reached the bottom of the stairs, and looked at Joe, as though he expected Joe to give in and start pledging his devotion to the Nazis right then and there. It was arrogant, it was irrational, and Carl still had enough frustration left over from his fight upstairs to give Joe a defiant edge as he tried his best to push back his own fear and doubt. "Got a cigarette?" Joe asked. "Maybe a cup of coffee?" "Sorry, no." "I don't suppose I could trouble you for a newspaper then." Leah came down the stairs next, followed by Max. Carl glanced back at them, and Joe knew that he was annoyed to have them there. He wanted to handle Joe himself, but Max was upset, and Leah was both proud and desperate at the same time. When she saw Joe, Leah put on a troubled expression, but her days of fooling him were over. With Max in the room and her lies put into context, Joe could see her for what she was. "I'm sorry to see you like this, Joe," she told him. Joe looked at Carl and told him, "This one's a liar. You should watch out for that." "I lied to you for a good reason. I have no reason to lie now," Leah replied, partly to Joe and partly to Carl. Joe winced and shook his head. He said nothing, but he was strongly hinting to Carl that she was lying. And she was. Leah knew as well as anyone that Joe wasn't what they were looking for, but she was allowing them to believe that he could speak to the ghosts just so she could claim to be useful and stay there with the man she loved. She did love Max. Though Joe second-guessed everything he felt from Leah, he couldn't deny the fact that every time she looked at him, he could feel her heart skip a beat. When she saw him, she saw someone to be proud of. He concluded that she was delusional, on top of dishonest. Carl smiled and squatted down to Joe's level, so that he could look Joe in the eyes without looking down at him. He didn't seem too surprised to hear that Leah was lying to him, but Joe could feel Max growing more upset. Max was an interesting character. He didn't love Leah as she loved him. He just loved the fact that she loved him. He loved the way she looked at him and made him feel important. When he looked at Carl, there was respect and maybe some amount of fondness. Carl mattered to him. What Carl thought of him mattered. And when Carl looked down on him, Max felt invisible. He wanted to prove that he was Carl's equal. "You have ears," Carl told Joe. "It doesn't surprise me that you try to turn us against each other, but to do that, you'd have to assume that I trust her and would feel betrayed by her. I don't. She is here because she is a novelty. Once that novelty wears off, she will be gone." Leah was angered by that comment. She turned and took a couple of steps, wanting to vent that anger. but she kept her mouth shut. "Why is the boy here?" Joe asked Carl. "Need a secretary to take notes?" Max pulled a gun from his pocket and aimed it at Joe. He said, "I don't take notes." Joe smiled and told him, "Maybe you should. It might help you keep up with the rest of the class." Max tightened his grip on the gun. He wanted to pull the trigger and be rid of Joe for good, but Carl put his hand up, stopping him from ending Joe's life. Joe looked to Max and said, "You should listen to your boss. You wouldn't want to get in trouble." "I am going to kill you. Then I'm going to kill the woman upstairs. And when all of this is done, the world will be bowing at our feet," Max told Joe through gritted teeth. "How about your baby, the one you had with your girlfriend's sister?" Joe asked him, then turned to Leah to see her reaction. She was smiling at him, watching as he went back and forth between his captors. She knew what he was doing, but she didn't say anything. If she did, she risked revealing herself to them, and there was no way to ensure her own safety once they knew the truth about Joe and how Leah had lied to them. "I'm proud of you, Joe," she cut in, stopping Max from responding to him and stopping Joe from pushing them harder. She wasn't really proud of him, of course. She was lying to him and not bothering to simply manipulate the truth as she had before. She continued, "To see you using your abilities, I'm proud to have been the one to push you so far." Carl looked to Leah, as though to ask what she was talking about. Joe looked to her as well, waiting to see what she would say. "He's reading our emotions," she told Carl. It seemed strange for her to speak the truth, but of course, she added her own twist to it. "He knows what we think. He knows what we feel. Any one of us is our own worst enemy, and he knows it. Oh, just think of the possibilities. To not simply talk to ghosts, but to listen to someone speak and know whether or not they're telling the truth. To listen to a radio broadcast and point out the lies." She tried to make it sound all so wonderful, and she nearly sold the act too. Maybe she would have if Joe didn't let out a chuckle. He turned to Carl and said, "I can't do any of that." "He lies. He doesn't want you to know what he's capable of," Leah insisted, in a tone that made her sound so pure and honest. "I've never seen anyone like him before. Isn't it funny how she inflates these stories about me? And in the end, it just makes her look better for bringing me here. If she's really lucky, maybe he'll kill her sister too." "I don't want my sister dead," Leah lied. That was a lie. "It was not. I love my sister, but some things are more important than love. We're fighting for a better future." Joe casually shook his head and said to Carl, "More lies. The only person she loves is the secretary over there, and she doesn't even realize how little he cares about her. He'd kill her himself if he thought it would get him what he wanted." "And what's that?" Carl asked, seeming amused by the whole performance. Joe wondered if he should be coming on so strongly at this point. Joe didn't answer the question. He looked from Carl to Max with what he hoped appeared to be a knowing expression on his face, but he kept his mouth shut. "Your abilities are remarkable," Carl told him. "Your control of them is impressive. I wish there was some way to convince you to join us and help us. I would rather die." "I know." Carl reached into his pocket and pulled out a syringe. It was filled with some sort of drug, that much was clear. Joe didn't bother asking what it was because whatever the answer, the odds of it being a pleasant experience were slim. He moved back, trying to find some way to avoid being injected, but there was nowhere for him to go and no weapon that he could use to fight Carl off. Once he reached the wall, he raised his arms and tried to fight, but it didn't take long for Carl to grab his arm and inject him with the medication. The room began to spin almost immediately. His tongue felt larger than usual, though he could have been imagining it. He tasted garlic in the back of his throat, and he couldn't understand why. Joe could barely keep his eyes open. Whatever control he had over his emotions, or anyone else's for that matter, was gone. He felt every bit of his own fear. He was helpless. He was a failure. The emotions of everyone around him began to seep into his own, conflicting with each other. In the city, there were hundreds of people surrounding him at any given moment, and the emotions blended together into a steady hum. It was overwhelming, but in many ways it was easier than dealing with the emotions of a few broken minds under one roof. He felt dirty and worthless. He felt unappreciated and angry. He felt desperate and uneasy. He could feel hints of emotion from nearby houses and from people just passing on the street. He could feel Annie and Yuta in another part of the house. He felt it all, and it hit him so hard that he could barely form thoughts. Carl pulled the gold wedding ring from his pocket and slipped it into Joe's. In that moment, he was struck by the emotions of a ghost who he hadn't even realized was nearby before. The ghost was frantic, angry, hopeful, and intrigued all at once, and with such intensity that Joe grabbed his head and curled up on the floor. He honestly didn't know whether or not he was screaming in pain. He couldn't push the emotions back. He couldn't repress his own or drown out the others. He couldn't focus all of his attention on any one direction. It was as though a dam had broken inside of him. As he struggled to find some way of processing everything that was surging through him, Joe caught a glimpse of Leah's face. She was watching him suffer, but she didn't seem to be enjoying it. He couldn't feel what she felt through the mess of emotions inside of him, but he wondered if there could be remorse or pity somewhere in there. If there was, she didn't express any of it. After watching him suffer for only a few moments, Leah walked to a far corner of the basement, turning her back on him. "Tell me what they're saying," Carl told Joe, in as soothing a voice as he could possibly muster. Joe didn't want to say anything. In his mind, he was telling himself to stay quiet, but he couldn't stop himself. No matter how hard he tried to repress it, he could hear himself screaming, "They know," over and over again. Roy was once again in a car on his way to New Jersey, alone, unemployed, and he didn't even have the address of the house that he was going to find. It was just beginning to drizzle as he stared out the window, watching the world move by. He knew that Joe and the woman who he believed to be Annalise Meyer were in danger, and he knew that he should have been completely focused on finding them and making sure that they were safe. But no matter how hard he tried to turn his thoughts in that direction, he always found himself staring at the raindrops on his window and remembering the look in Mary's eyes as she was slapping him in the face. She hated him. She wasn't the first person to hate him. In his line of work, he'd managed to upset more than his share of people, some of whom he had considered friends at one point or another. He didn't have a family, or even a dog. There was nobody who would love him unconditionally, and the conditions never seemed to work in his favor. He just wished that she was different. For the first time, he wished that he was different. He wished that he knew how to be the kind of person that she could look at with that sparkle in her eye that he hadn't seen since the first time they met outside of the deli. But there wasn't any use in wishing, because no matter how he felt or what he did, he always seemed to make a mess of things. For some people, it came so easily. Joe or Sam didn't have to try. They had people who cared about them and wanted to protect them. But as he sat in that car, on his way to another great story, he knew that if he never made it back to the city, nobody would think twice about it. There was a good excuse for him, of course. Roy couldn't afford to have friends, because his job demanded that he be an observer of the world, and not a part of it. Emotions would make him sloppy. A conscience would make him biased. As long as he could slip in and out of the scene of the crime without making an impact, he could report the way things actually were, and not just the act that people were putting on for his amusement. It was a perfectly good excuse. It had worked for years, and even he believed it, before he met her, before they shared lunch together and laughed together. At the time, he didn't even think much of it. She was a pretty girl and he was hungry, so it seemed like an easy enough decision to make, buying a sandwich off of her so he wouldn't have to stand in line. And that's all it should have been. He should have been able to walk away from it without caring, but he couldn't get her out of his thoughts. He couldn't forget her smile, which was a good thing, too, since he hadn't seen her smile since that day. She hated him too much for that, and why not? He'd proven that he was more interested in the next big story than he was in being friendly. Why should she care? The story. That's what it always came down to. Ever since he was a little boy, that's what his focus had always been on, digging up every detail he could find, trying to put the pieces together. But even then, things never worked out the way he wanted them to. The story. It was almost funny to think of it in those terms anymore, given the fact that he had been fired from his job and didn't have a newspaper to write for. Maybe the truth was that it wasn't about the story this time. Maybe he was just looking to make sure that his article hadn't somehow resulted in Joe getting killed. After all, Joe was a good person. Joe cared about people. People cared about Joe. Roy would feel awful about getting him killed, and Mary would hate him even more. They know. They know. Why couldn't he stop himself from screaming those words? What had Carl injected him with? More importantly, when would it be out of his system? He knew that he was in danger of revealing something to his captors that he didn't want them to know, and he kept telling himself to be quiet, but he kept repeating those words. Tell me what they know, Carl pushed. Tell me who they are. Joe lowered his voice to a whisper, yet still repeated, They know. They know. They know. Was a whisper progress? Was it closer to being quiet? Joe didn't know if he was regaining any amount of control over himself, but at least he hadn't said anything else. Part of him was afraid to even think such a thing. The more he told himself to be quiet, the more he repeated those words. So he had to wonder if by being thankful for the fact that it was only those 3 words, he would somehow push himself into saying something more. He couldn't think straight. He couldn't find that line where all of the outside emotions stopped and his own emotions began. He couldn't picture Maggie and Norma. All he could do was curl up on the floor and keep whispering those words. I need to know who they are, Joe, Carl pressed once again. The agitation in his voice was growing. What do they know? Joe's eyes met Carl's, and he took a deep breath before whispering, They know. Carl released a frustrated roar as he moved toward one of the boxes that were stacked in the basement and put his fist through it. He then turned toward Max and took a step. Max pulled back just a little bit as Carl moved closer. He was nervous. Carl pulled a small pad and a pencil from his pocket. As he started writing, he told Max, Go upstairs. Tell Yuta that I need her to go to the hardware store and pick up a few items. He tore off the piece of paper and handed it to Max. Max didn't hesitate to rush up the stairs. Leah stepped closer to Carl as he turned to face Joe once again. The anger inside of him was clear, but he was trying to get it under control, taking deep breaths and balling his fists as tightly as possible. Once he was more calm, Carl squatted down next to Joe and very softly said, I need you to tell me what you know. For both of our sakes, please tell me. They know, Joe repeated, turning away from Carl. They know. Carl grabbed Joe's face and forced him to look at him as he said, What I gave you was mild compared to what you may be forced to endure if you don't cooperate. The dosage was low. It will wear off within a few hours, and if you help me, you will be fine. However, if you do not cooperate, I will be forced to give you another much larger dose. I will be forced to try other methods of getting you to speak. And the more I try, the harder it will be for you to find your way back from this. Leah took another step toward him and asked, What do you mean? What are you going to do to him? What have you done to my sister? Please do not talk to me right now, Carl replied, without even looking at her. Leah wasn't one to back down easily. When she wanted an answer, she did whatever she had to do to get it. So she pressed harder and said, This isn't necessary. You're poisoning him and hurting him. That's how you get someone to do what you want them to do? Carl was once again getting mad. He stood up and turned toward Leah. He stepped toward her, moving like a predator in the wild, about to pounce on its prey. Yet his voice was remarkably calm when he said, You are nothing. You are here because I will you to be here, and the moment that I wish you to be gone, you will be, and nobody will ever know what happened to you. Now, will you be quiet or will you be gone? The choice is yours to make. Leah took a step toward Carl, and in a calm voice of her own, she said, You are remarkably petulant, and that is why you will fail. People like Joe don't respond to being screamed at. The more you press him, the more he will press back. I have spent years training for this assignment, years learning how to understand how these minds work, Carl replied, grabbing Leah by the neck and pushing her against the wall, looking into her eyes. I will not take advice from someone whose mind is as faulty as yours. Leah could barely breathe, but she pushed back. What must it feel like to know that you'll never be able to truly understand how their minds work, to feel what they feel, to see what they see? Oh, my mind might be faulty, but my broken, feeble mind simply brings me down to your level. She's gone, came Max's voice, cutting through the tension in the room. Carl held Leah's stare for a moment longer before throwing her aside and turning to Max and asking, "What do you mean?" "I mean Yuta is gone. She took the reports and left for the meeting," Max answered. Carl looked at his watch and then turned away from everyone else in the room so that he could gather his thoughts. He put a hand on his head and kept drawing in long, deep breaths. "We weren't ready," Carl said, mainly to himself. "We could have gotten so much more. We could have shown them so much more." He turned to Joe and dropped to his knees beside him, pulling Joe up and forcing Joe to look at him. By this point, Joe had finally stopped repeating those words, and now he stared at Carl with expressionless eyes. "You," Carl began, before trailing off. He eventually found his words again and told Joe, "You should have cooperated. It would have been so much better for you if you had cooperated." Carl then stood and looked at Max, pointing a finger at him and saying, "You go to the store. Get me everything on that list." Max seemed a little surprised. He told Carl, "We have weeks now. We can wear him down before the next meeting." "No, we will get the answers that we want from him now. I have waited long enough. I have put up with enough delays. I have tried being polite and accommodating, and what did that get me?" Carl asked. "If you want something in this life, you do not ease into it, or try to change the minds of your enemy. You break them. You reach into their souls and you destroy them. We are fighting a war for the future of humanity." "I thought you said that he was the future of humanity," Max replied, trying his best to sound strong but failing. "He could be. He could be a god amongst men. But look at him. He sits there on a basement floor, refusing to take his place in history. In doing so, he betrays his kind. And if there's one thing that I will not tolerate, it's a traitor." Max didn't respond to Carl. He stood there, watching Carl as though waiting to see what he would do next. "Go," Carl told Max again, in a calm voice that was more unnerving than if he had screamed the order. "And take her with you." Max hesitated for only one moment longer before he turned and walked up the stairs. Leah glanced toward Joe. She would have preferred to stay and try things her own way, but she soon followed Max. Once they were gone, Carl lowered himself onto the floor and sat beside Joe. He looked toward the window, at the gray daylight that was lighting up the basement. "When I was a boy, my grandmother used to tell me that if you listened very closely to the rain, you could hear the whispers of your dead loved ones," Carl told Joe. "She was a liar." Max was standing by the back door, putting on his jacket, when Leah walked out of the basement and joined him in the kitchen. "I want to see her," Leah told him, rather than asked. "We have work to do." "I want to speak with my sister. Our errands can wait." "We were given an order." "I don't follow orders," Leah said, walking to Max and putting her hand on his chest. "I came here for you, not for Carl, and not for his cause. His cause is my cause. If you don't understand that, maybe you don't deserve to be here." Now putting her arms around Max, Leah said, "I will follow you wherever you go. I will listen to whatever you want to tell me. I will help you become everything that I know you can be. But first, I want to speak to my sister." She kissed him, as passionately as she could. Max put his arms around her and pressed her against the wall, returning the kiss and proving himself the dominant partner in their relationship. When the kiss was finally over and Max stepped back, he handed her the key to one of the bedrooms. "You only have a couple of minutes, and then we have to go." Leah nodded her response and took the key. She walked to the doorway that led up the stairs, closing the door behind her. She was alone in the dark stairway, keeping her hand on the wall so that she wouldn't lose her balance as she climbed the narrow stairs. Honestly, she didn't know what she expected to find once she opened the door to her sister's bedroom. She didn't know what she wanted to say to Annie. All she knew was that she had to see her sister, to see if they had done to her what they had done to Joe, to see if Carl was speaking from experience when he told Joe that the more time they spent trying to get him to talk with their drugs and whatever else they might use, the harder it would be for Joe to come back from it. She walked into the first room, staring at the bedroom door as she went. She could hear the sound of her sister singing softly to her child. It was the same sweet melody that their mother used to sing to the girls when they were children, when they were the same. Her hand was shaking by the time she raised the key to the lock and opened the door. At first, she didn't see her sister in the room. She stood just outside, listening to the sound of the singing, until it stopped. "It's me," came Annie's voice, though it sounded so much weaker than Leah remembered. "Or you, or whoever you are today." Annie laughed, and the sound of that laugh sent a chill up Leah's spine. She walked through the doorway and turned to her right, where she found Annie sitting in a rocking chair holding her cooing baby. The bright, vibrant smile that her sister had always had was gone. Her hair was frizzy and looked as though it hadn't been washed in quite some time. She wore a dull nightgown, but her eyes were still the same bright, beautiful eyes that she had always known. Leah was breathless. She could feel a lump growing in her throat. "Did you hate me that much?" Annie asked her. Leah could feel a tear falling down her cheek as she replied, "No." Her voice was so shaky and small that she had to repeat the word again just to be heard. "No." "Then why?" Leah walked to where Annie was sitting, and she knelt down in front of her, looking up at her sister and saying, "Because I loved you as much as everyone else did, and I hated you because of it, because I knew that you were better than me. I knew that you deserved to have what I'd lost. I didn't think about what would happen to you. I just needed him to look at me the way he did before he knew the truth about me. I needed to give him a reason to love me. So you gave him me. I gave him the best part of myself. I hear whispers. Every day, every hour, every minute, every second. I hear things around me that even I can't see. I see things that I don't want to. They've given you the medication." Annie laughed so loudly that the sound of it caught Leah off guard, and she looked toward the door as though she would get in trouble for being in that room. "Medication?" Annie asked, still amused. "Is that what you call it? The medication was the easy part. They dug a hole inside of me and crawled into my head. I can't get them out." "Maybe I can help you," Leah started, before trailing off. She honestly didn't know what she could do. Annie smiled at her sister, showing her yellowed teeth, and said, "If you get them out of my head, I'm not sure there would be anything left." "Do you hate me?" Annie reached down and put a hand on her sister's face. It was a soft, loving touch, but she never answered the question. She simply sat back in her rocking chair and said, "I haven't told them the name of my baby. Do you want to know it?" Leah couldn't bring herself to look down at the baby. She hated it. She hated everything that child represented, but she refused to express that hatred in any way, and instead she nodded to her sister. "I call him Warren." "After Daddy?" Leah smiled. She hated her father, too, but she knew how much Annie had adored him. "No matter what happens to me, Annie started, before suddenly stopping and turning her head to her left, as though watching something move across her room. "Is someone here with us?" Leah asked, looking for herself but seeing nothing. "He likes to see me locked away in my room," Annie replied. "It makes him feel like he's home again." Leah didn't know what her sister was talking about. She didn't know whether there was really a ghost in the room with them, or if her sister was simply insane. "If you told them what they wanted to know, maybe they would go easier on you," she suggested to Annie. "They want the world. Then give it to them. Let them have it. Save yourself. Save your child." "They can't win," Annie said, as her eyes filled with tears. She began to sob as she said, "They can't have it." "Tell me what they can't have. What do you know?" "I know it all. Seeds are planted. They're growing the tree of destruction hissing in my ear, but what are you saying?" The atomic weapon burning the sky, disintegrating people where they stand. They just don't know how. Not yet. Do you know how? Leah asked. The greatest minds in the world are chipping away at the idea. It's a race to see who's first, but even if we win, we lose. If we win, they'll know the solution. We're solving the problem for them. Do you know the solution to the problem? Annie, tell me what you know. Save your baby. I did, Annie screamed. I saved my baby. I saved my baby. She was going to hurt him, and I did what I had to do to save him. Annie put a hand over her mouth, as though she couldn't speak the truth about her situation. You told Yuta? Leah asked. Annie nodded. Good, Leah smiled, standing up again. She walked toward the door. Leah, Annie called after her. Leah stopped and turned, waiting to hear her sister tell her how much she was hated and how rotten she was to the core. I've always loved you, no matter what you've done, Annie told her. I can't let them have you. I want them to have me, Leah replied. Not them. The good ones are coming, Annie told her sister. She raised a hand, as though shushing someone else in the room, before continuing to tell Leah. I can't hate you. I want to, but I can't. You need to leave. You need to go now. Leah took one last look at her sister before leaving the room and locking the door behind her. She hurried through the dark outer room and down the stairs. Max was waiting for her by the back door. He was holding her coat out to her as she walked into the kitchen. We should hurry, he told her. Whatever Carl's looking for, Yuta has it. Annie told her whatever she knows, something about a bomb. Max paused, thinking over the situation and weighing his options. After a moment, he asked her, Are you sure? Fairly. Then maybe we don't need to go to the hardware store. If she has the information that we need for the meeting, maybe Carl can stop whatever he's planning on doing. We should tell him. Max started to move toward the basement door, but Leah put a hand on his chest and stopped him. She moved closer to him until they were nearly hugging, so that he could feel her body next to his. We should go, she told Max. Now. The way she said it sounded colder than she had intended. She didn't mean to order him around, she simply meant to push him in the right direction. She smiled sweetly at him and said, We'll tell Carl everything once we get back. That way he won't be able to yell at us for not getting what he wants. Max seemed to accept that idea, and why wouldn't he? Nobody wanted to give Carl a chance to scream at them or threaten them. He was a loose cannon, and that's why Leah had decided that they were better off without him. Mary checked the time on a clock that sat on a shelf behind the counter of the bookstore. She must have looked at it every 10 seconds, ever since she'd learned the truth. She still had a hard time believing it. Of all the people in the world that Otto Dorr could have hit with his car, it had to be her family. And now his wife and partners had either killed Joe or were holding him hostage. And for what? Because they thought that he could talk to ghosts? He couldn't. She knew that, but oh, how she hoped that they still believed that he could. If they knew the truth, he was probably dead already. Over and over again, she ran through the story in her head, and it never started making sense to her. Each time she tried to understand what was happening, she just wound up feeling more helpless and more insignificant. Joe always talked about the dominoes falling, and how each piece of the puzzle played an important role in some elaborately designed pattern. What part did she play? What purpose did she serve? Was she simply there to cry over her lost loved ones and tell a slimy reporter all of Joe's secrets? Had her domino already fallen? How long do you think it takes to get there? Sam asked her, sounding almost as nervous as she was. Of course he would. Everything that Harvey had been trying to tell him for 2 years was in that house, right along with Joe. I don't know, she sighed. With traffic and weather, I don't know. It was raining outside. Through the front window of the bookstore, she could see people rushing to get wherever they were going, covering their heads with umbrellas, newspapers, or whatever else they could manage to block the rain with. When she looked at them, all she could see were dominoes. How many of them were playing a part in whatever plan was unfolding around her? How many of them had their own pattern being set up? How many of those patterns could she be a part of without ever even knowing it? The way Joe spoke of patterns always sounded fantastical to Mary. He talked as though they were a game of some kind, and that gave him peace of mind. He could step back and watch the world around him and marvel at the complexity of it all. Now that Mary was beginning to understand what he was always talking about, the idea scared her. She didn't like thinking about how she could be a part of other people's lives without ever knowing it. She didn't like to think that at that very moment, Joe could be begging for his life, and there was nothing that she could do about it, because her part was already over. She had given Roy the story about him, and she introduced him to Sam, who brought ghosts into his life. She was even the one who found Avon by the Sea on a map. Without her, Joe would be sitting in that bookstore at that very moment, and none of this worry would be necessary. Sam's keys were sitting on the counter, among all of the files and notes. On his keychain, Sam kept Harvey's good luck charm, and Mary found herself staring at it. As she began to think about everything that was happening, she came to a strange realization. As scared as she was, and as horrible as all of this could turn out, Mary couldn't wish that none of it had ever happened, because no matter how terrible fate had treated her, it also brought Sam into her life. He was pacing in front of the counter, taking deep breaths and rubbing his head with each turn. He was just as nervous and scared as she was, and she had completely overlooked his feelings because she was too focused on her own. Mary couldn't imagine how strange Sam must feel to have a dead cousin haunting him, to have his entire life stripped away from him, and to spend years thinking that he was crazy, and for what? What answers could he get that would make his situation any better? What resolution would there be, whether Joe came home or not? Stepping out from behind the counter, Mary walked to Sam and stopped him from pacing. She didn't say anything to him at first. She simply looked him in the eyes and they both knew what the other was feeling. She then put her arms around him and rested her head on his chest, telling herself that she was comforting him, but she needed to be held just as much as he did. "We should have gone with them," she told him. The thought had crossed my mind. "Sitting here is killing me. I can't stand not doing anything." "What is there for us to do?" Sam asked her. "Even if we did go with them, we'd have to stand back and watch." "There must be something for us to do. Some way to get answers or... I don't know." Sam's arms tightened around her. She could tell that he was just as restless as she was, but neither one of them knew which way to turn or where to go. All they could figure to do was stand there, waiting for answers to come to them, and Mary hated it. Her eyes went back to the keychain on the counter, and to the lucky charm attached to it. Suddenly, she was struck by a thought. "You had your keys with you that day at the fair, didn't you?" she asked him. "I always have them with me." "At work? On the base? Every time you felt Harvey around you, you had that lucky charm of his nearby." "I suppose so," Sam shrugged. "I took it so that I could have something of his nearby. I suppose that maybe that's how he finds me." He sounded so matter-of-fact about the idea of Harvey being drawn to that charm, but the realization was causing Mary's mind to race. She was helpless to find any information about Joe's situation, but maybe they could try to understand more about Harvey. Maybe they could finally figure out a way for Harvey to give Sam the message that he'd wanted to give him ever since he died. "Get your keys," Mary told Sam, rushing behind the counter to get her jacket and make one quick call. "Where are we going?" "To the one place where one of us has actually seen Harvey since his death." It was hard for Joe to keep track of how much time was passing as he lay on the basement floor, falling in and out of consciousness. When he woke, he could hear himself muttering. Usually what he muttered was little more than moans and groans. At first, he didn't even realize that those sounds were coming from him, and just as he realized that the moans were his own, he would usually drift back to sleep. Carl was always there with him, sitting on the floor and listening to Joe, as though he might decipher the sounds and have the truth revealed to him at last. His patience did not pay off. No matter what drugs they gave him or what devices they tortured him with, Joe would not tell Carl anything useful, simply because he didn't have the ability to. He could tell Carl that ghosts were happy or sad, but if they were looking for specific information, they were out of luck. His mind floated helplessly atop the surging river of emotions. He could feel a jumble of what was inside of that rush, but to attempt anything specific was futile. All he could do was attempt to stay afloat long enough to be rescued and pray that once he was free and the drugs were out of his system, he would be able to pull his mind together. The rain was coming down hard this time as Joe began to come around. He could still hear the sound of his own voice as he came to his senses, but something had changed. This time he was speaking words. He thought it was all a jumble and that he hadn't revealed anything of importance to Carl, but through his blurred vision he could see Carl with a pencil in his hand, keeping notes. "Who is Maggie?" Carl asked him. The sound of that man speaking the name of his daughter only added to the nausea that Joe felt creeping up on him as he began to pull himself together. "You say her name more than anything else," Carl explained, "and always with such pain. So I wonder, was she a lover, a child?" Joe wanted to speak, but his mouth felt dry and his lips felt swollen. He had been speaking in his sleep only moments earlier, but those words were involuntary. Now, as he tried to control his own body, he found it difficult. Carl moved closer and put a glass of water to Joe's lips, allowing him to drink. There had been no glass when Carl first injected Joe with the drugs, which meant that Carl must have left the basement and returned at some point. For all Joe knew, it could have been hours or days since he was last fully aware of his surroundings. Though the water could have been poisoned, Joe couldn't help but drink. At that point, he didn't figure that he had very much to lose. "Maggie?" Carl asked again. "The dog I had as a child," Joe told him. The sound of his own voice disturbed him. He sounded so distant. Carl smiled, obviously not believing what Joe told him, but accepting the answer nonetheless. He said, "You're coming out of the daze." "How long has it been?" "Does it matter? Does time matter to a man who has no hope, no chance of salvation?" Joe was suddenly aware of a ghost in the room with them, possibly more than one, but it was hard to make out specifics. All he could feel were the distinctive razor-sharp emotions that were cutting through his head and causing a throbbing pain behind his eye. From somewhere in this mess of ghostly emotions, Joe did feel hope. Maybe Harvey was there, telling him to hold on just a little bit longer, because help was on the way. The memory came back to him. He couldn't be certain, of course, but he remembered feeling hopeful that Harvey had gotten a message across to Sam. It was something to hold on to. "There is hope in faith," he heard himself say. It was something that Norma always told him when things seemed particularly hopeless. He focused on that memory of Norma, picturing her smile and remembering the sound of her laughter, which he hadn't heard for quite some time, even before she died. He remembered the smell of the perfume that she only wore in the springtime. It reminded him of home. Then he looked to the window, at the rain that was falling outside. It reminded him of the night that Norma died, and somewhere deep in the jumble of emotions that Joe was feeling, he felt a spark of sadness and loss, so painful that he could feel his heart tightening in his chest. But then the feeling was gone, washed away by the flood of other emotions. Somewhere in the house he could hear the baby crying, and he remembered the woman who was locked away. He had to help her. He had to save her, but he could barely move. He was useless to her until he could pull himself together. Carl moved to a chair and sat down, setting the glass down on the floor beside him and watching Joe with what almost seemed like admiration in his eyes. "I've often wondered what I would do with abilities such as yours, to see what you see," Carl told Joe, with awe in his voice. "I imagine myself using those abilities to better the world, to make a difference. And then I look at you, a psychic who runs a bookstore, living a life so remarkably unremarkable." "I'm not psychic," Joe corrected, mostly out of habit and quite possibly putting his entire act in jeopardy. But Carl ignored what he said and continued with his own thought. "It saddens me to see you wasting your potential. It angers me." "What doesn't anger you?" Carl laughed and said, "It's true. I've never been able to control my own emotions. I have a hard time controlling myself. Perhaps that's why I could never possess the power that you have. It would require discipline, self-control. To not immediately react to everything I see and hear is hard enough as it is." Joe didn't respond. As long as Carl was content to ramble on about himself, Joe was content to allow it. The longer Carl focused on something else, the more time Joe would have to try to push through the drugs in his system. I just feel everything so much, Carl told him. Perhaps that's my downfall. Perhaps someone in your position has to be able to not feel. Maybe if you had these emotions inside of you, you wouldn't have your abilities. Perhaps if I could rid myself of feeling, I could acquire them. Joe could hear himself laughing at Carl. It was completely involuntary, though it wasn't hard to figure out why he would be laughing. Carl seemed confused by the laughter. He looked at Joe with questioning eyes. Responding to the unspoken question, Joe answered, I wish I could rid myself of the emotions right now. You do feel them, but how do you control them? Joe closed his eyes and pictured the faces of the two people that he loved the most in the world. He pictured Maggie's eyes, lighting up when she saw him, and the way it made him feel. He pictured Norma, lying next to him in bed. He could almost hear the sound of her soft, steady breathing. Then he remembered the night they died, and through the flood of emotion that was rushing through him, he once again felt that heart-gripping pain. He tried to hold on to it. As much as it hurt him, he knew that it was his pain, and nobody else's. He knew where he ended and the rest of the world began. But as soon as he felt that clarity, it began to slip away into the drug-induced haze. How do you control what you feel? Carl asked again, realizing that Joe was beginning to slip away once again and trying to pull him back to the conversation. Joe wasn't going to give him an answer. Instead, he told Carl, Your clothes are the same. It's still raining outside. It's the same day. Realizing that Joe's defiant attitude was returning, Carl stood from his chair and walked to the other side of the basement where the tools were stored. He began to dig through them. It does matter how much time has passed, Joe insisted. It matters. When Carl turned to face Joe once again, he was holding a pair of pliers. He walked to where Joe was lying, and he sat down on the floor, holding the pliers out where Joe could see them. The medication I gave you was a first attempt. It was a low dosage, meant to see how you would respond. You did not respond well, Carl informed Joe. He tapped the ground with the pliers and continued. Your violent reaction was very different than what I've seen before. Your emotional reaction, your pain. But that's not to say that the drugs didn't work. We simply need to figure out the proper method of using it. Trial and error. Oh, and that's just one of the ways we might try stimulating your ability. There are many theories as to what causes an ability such as yours to manifest. I don't want to bore you with the science of it all, but there are many people who would love to understand how the manipulation of the human brain might result in a more focused ability. We've had some moderate success in that area when it comes to Annie. With her, the combination of drugs and electrical stimulation seems to have broken down some of the barriers that her mind created to filter her ability. It's fascinating, really. Joe didn't know whether or not Carl was trying to scare him, but he wasn't scared. Or rather, he couldn't feel his own fear through all of the other emotions that were running through him. Panic, helplessness, joy, hope, anger, sorrow, fear, amusement. If Carl was looking to remove the barriers in Joe's mind, he had done so with such ease that Joe was almost embarrassed by the fact. Only, of course, he wouldn't know that he was embarrassed any more than he would know that he was scared. He felt so much at that moment that he could feel no one thing at all. In a way, Carl's success only made Joe more resistant to whatever came next. What are the pliers for? Joe asked with a steady voice. My teeth? Carl seemed amused by the notion as he said, No, of course not. Why would I want to pull out your teeth? I just figured that I'd want to pull out your teeth. Carl shook his head and stood up, still holding the pliers and telling Joe, I have a light switch to fix upstairs, but I'll be back soon, and I want you to think about helping me. Save yourself more pain. He was about to walk away, but stopped himself, smiling at the absurdity of the thought. Then, without warning, he stomped the heel of his foot down on Joe's hand as hard as he could.
This
is the voice of the Embers, where stories burn and fade.